Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Gender Justice Conference. My name is Jamie Trogus. I use she, her pronouns, and I will be the facilitator for today's session. We joined today's conference with the intent to explore the knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary to engage in social change work with a special focus on disrupting gender oppression. Thank you for being here with us. You are currently in the session, What does the EcoGender Gap mean for Westchester and the world? Just a note, we will be recording this session. We are in a regular Zoom, which means that both your video and your name will be visible during the session. We invite you to change your Zoom name and turn off your video to promote anonymity if needed. In addition, please know that we do not have an ASL interpreter for this session. However, captioning is available via Zoom during the session. I'd invite you at this time to use the rename function on Zoom to include your pronouns next to your name. In addition, Callie Anderson will be our Zoom moderator. Callie will monitor the chat. If you have any questions about technology or how to access the live captioning, please use the chat and we will do our best to answer your questions. In addition, Callie will help ensure that we all are upholding our community agreement, which can be found in our conference support hub. If at any time you are in violation of our community agreement, you may be asked to leave. During our session, we recognize that the topics being presented may contain potentially triggering or activating content for members of our audience and our community. We're committed to honoring the journey of each individual takes some healing, so we invite you to engage with this content in a way that is safe and true to your healing. We believe that the topic, the EcoGender Gap, is important, and therefore providing this note that the content that follows will discuss the impacts of climate change on historically marginalized populations, as well as gender-based violence. We want to create a space where folks can share their stories while doing so in a considerate and sensitive way. Please feel free to take a break, to step away, and to turn off your camera at any point in today's presentation to take care of yourself during these conversations. Now, I have the honor of introducing the presenters for today's session. We're joined here today by Jocelyn Brown and Nicole Salapong. Jocelyn Brown is a third-year political science, international relations major with minors in civil and professional leadership, global studies, and philosophy. She's a peer educator at the Center for Women and Gender Equity, the president of Model UN, and the director of undergraduate research for the Honors College. Nicole Salapong is a third-year English writings major with minors in business and technical writing and sustainability and resilience. She's a peer educator in the Office of Sustainability and a member of the Honors College. At this time, I'd like to turn the session over to our presenters. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. Give me a second to share my screen. All right. Like Jamie said, welcome to What Does the EcoGender Gap Mean for Westchester and the World? My name is Jocelyn. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a third-year international relations major and a peer educator at the Center for Women and Gender Equity.
And I'm Nicole Salapong, she, her pronouns. I am an English major and a peer educator for the Office of Sustainability.
And we'll get right into it. So this presentation will be going over 4 sections. First, how gender intersects with climate change, how other marginalized identities intersect with climate change, some possible solutions around reframing sustainability that Westchester can use, and one possible solution, which is storytelling to connect people to their personal connections to climate change. To get us started, we're going to do a little introductory activity with everyone. We would like you to share your name in the chat and one word that you would associate with the climate change crisis. So we all have very negative words here: extreme, misunderstood, not addressed enough. So keep these in mind and we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation.
Okay, to start us off, we're going to be talking a little bit about how traditional gender roles intersect with the climate change issue. So just as a brief overview of what the EcoGender Gap is, it's the disparity between the environmentally sustainable choices of women and men. There are a collection of studies that have shown that men are less likely to engage in green behaviors. A theory as to why this occurs is this desire to maintain and affirm gender identities and stereotypes. Many different societal expectations and marketing techniques sort of play into this idea that going green is an inherently feminine activity, such as products that are marketed towards sustainability, like cleaning products or organic foods, are marketed more towards women because there is still a lingering belief that women are in charge of the domestic sphere. There's also this alignment of environmentalism with traditional female gender roles due to caretaking being seen as an important component of traditional feminine roles and stereotypes. So all of this comes together and leads to something called the green feminine stereotype, which is a pervasive belief that environmentally conscious activities and behaviors are considered more feminine than masculine. There are a bunch of studies across the world that highlight this sort of thing. In Sweden, there is a study that highlighted that women spend more time than men seeking information on sustainable consumption. In Japan, there was one that found that women are more likely and more willing to pay more for environmental products. So these aforementioned consumers who are concerned with maintaining this masculine image may be less willing or less disposed to engage with green behaviors because of these societal expectations. And while this definitely does not account for all men, based on the number of studies about the green feminine stereotype and its real life effects, there is definitely a significant number that are contributing to this sort of apathy in terms of environmental sustainability. A lot of reports show that consumers who engage with green behavior are generally seen as more feminine and that men were less likely to choose green products. However, when masculinity was affirmed, likely due to changing colors, shapes, sounds, and fonts that may be seen as more stereotypically masculine, men were actually more likely to choose green products than when masculinity was not affirmed. However, the study did not provide strong evidence that women were as motivated as men to maintain their gender identity, but the green feminine stereotype was as prevalent among women as men, showing that this is a very long-lasting historical problem. Men who supported the environmental movement into the late 1900s were concerned that they would be emasculated and seen as bird and bunny boys, and male environmental activists like John Muir were described as effeminate and unmanly. So women, more often than not, are going to be the ones leading the charge regarding sustainable behaviors and are the ones who are going to be most affected by climate change. It's also believed that women and children are 14 times more likely to die during disasters. An example of this is Hurricane Katrina. At the time, women made up about 54% of the population in New Orleans, but they made up about 80% of the people who were left behind during and after the storm. On an international scale, it's documented that women are more often than not the ones who are mobilizing communities to respond to disasters by doing things such as raising money, forming networks to meet social needs, and other behind-the-scenes work. So when these relief efforts that are intended for everyone only rely on existing structures of resource distribution that reflect a patriarchal structure of society, women are going to be the ones who are marginalized in their access to these relief resources. There's other information that notes that 70% of the 1.3 billion people in the developing world who are living below the poverty line are women. So really, women do need attention in regard to climate change because they do have a higher mortality rate during natural disasters that are spurred by climate change, and they're generally more environmentally conscious. Therefore, they do need a seat at the table in making decisions about the environment. And this is something that Jocelyn's going to get into very soon. Unequal gender relations are not the cause of climate change, nor do they aggravate these problems. But gender relations do determine how the environment is managed and how society at large responds to these problems.
So next we'll be going over a few other identities that intersect with climate change and some criticisms of this gender-first approach when it comes to the effects of climate change. So in her essay, Virtue and Vulnerability, Discourses on Women, Gender, and Climate Change, Aurora Janssen writes that two themes occur in climate literature when it comes to women across the world. Women in the global north are considered virtuous because, by and large, they care more about climate change than men in the global north. When it comes to the global south, however, these women are considered nothing more but vulnerable because they are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than men in the global south. These women are considered in large, broad, homogeneous categories. But of course, women are not just part of these categories. Women can be from rich and poor environments, urban and rural, different countries and nationalities. And when we're talking about the global north and south for this presentation, this is the map to keep in mind. The global north is in blue, the global south is in red. If you think that it doesn't make any sense based on cardinal directions, you would be correct. It's based on colonialism. So the tendency to predetermine all women as economically and socially marginalized in the same way is a huge problem, because a lot of it has to do with social location, global location, and social class. So this quote from Aurora Janssen really sums up her entire article, which reads, "A poor man in India is unlikely to be as polluting as a woman in Sweden, or for that matter, as much as a polluter as a rich woman in India." So of course, again, women are not a homogenized category. Climate change's cruel irony is that it does affect the most the people that have the least responsibility for it. So this is not always women, but it is always those in poverty. So we need to keep power relations in mind when it comes to all types of identities. We need to be able to see women, just like men, as being responsible for, as well as mitigating agents when it comes to climate change. Continuing with social class, when it comes to wealthy developed states and the global north, areas like Scandinavia that have higher levels of GDP, of income equality, and gender equality do also all have higher levels of sustainability and green policies as well. But that doesn't mean that they're perfect. In a 2004 study that tracked pro-environmental behaviors in 22 developed nations, they found that while women were more likely than men to participate in private pro-environmental behaviors, so things within the domestic sphere, such as recycling, men were still more likely than women to participate in public pro-environmental behaviors. So that would be things like protesting and running for office. There could be two possible reasons here. The first reason is that women in these so-called developed and equal nations still feel less comfortable than men in public spaces and running for office. And the second economic reason is the double day that women are expected to participate in these countries. And the double day means that they work all day at their job, and then when they come home at night, they're still expected to be the ones in charge of everything around the domestic sphere. So moving on to wealthy people, as I mentioned, women can be rich or poor, and the intersection of gender and social class is extremely important when it comes to understanding consumption patterns. Wealthy people, of course, consume far more than their low-income counterparts. And gender differences in consumption are most aggravated between poor women and rich men. But wealthy women's consumption rates are not automatically lower than men's. They're usually about the same or even a little bit more. Another problematic factor here is that in some feminist circles, the assumption is to bring women up to men's level of economic prosperity. And when I say that, we're not talking about things like equal pay, which of course should be true everywhere, but we're talking about problematic like girl boss CEO narratives. So while women are encouraged to go into business and STEM fields, the same is not true for encouraging men to go into caretaking or humanities fields. These fields are the problems themselves. I'm talking about business and STEM because of things like such as the long airplane travel. So the problem is not that women are not in these industries, but that these industries themselves are unsustainable and should be worked on no matter who is in them. The final problem is wealth inequality, both within countries, between classes in those countries, and between countries themselves. And wealth inequality is only getting worse in recent decades and is the most dire trend of the current era. Most of the countries with the worst statistics when it comes to wealth inequality between classes are actually, again, these Western developed nations. So when it comes to sustainability and green growth, such as green construction projects, we must keep in mind that focusing on the economic side of the environment without focusing on social justice will lead to green growth for only a few people instead of everyone. This income equality is why Ajuman, who I will mention again later, says that the global north and global south have two very different policy priorities when it comes to tackling climate change. In the global north, you see policies called ecological sustainability that focus on what you would first associate with climate change, such as the ozone layer, recycling, air pollution, and things like that. And all of those are very important, but the global south advocates as well for a lot of anti-poverty efforts in their climate change efforts. So this video here is by the National Adaptation Plan Global Network, which helps developing countries develop plans to tackle climate change. And they show the intersection of identities here in this video and how they integrate them into their plans.
Why gender matters for effective adaptation to climate change. The impacts of climate change, including seasonal changes, sea level rise, and extreme weather events, are already affecting people's lives in both subtle and devastating ways. Adaptation to climate change is the process of building the resilience of communities, ecosystems, and economies to these impacts. It requires action at all levels, from individuals, governments, and the international community. For adaptation to be effective, it's important to recognize that the impacts of climate change affect different people in different ways. How they are affected depends on where they live and how they earn their livelihoods. In many contexts, it also depends on their gender. Women, men, and non-binary people often play different roles in their households and communities. They also have different access to resources and opportunities. These differences influence their vulnerability to climate risks, as well as their capacity to prepare for and manage the impacts. Women and non-binary people are often at a disadvantage as they face barriers in realizing their rights due to norms, traditions, and policies that perpetuate gender inequality. Other forms of discrimination, for example, based on race, being indigenous, or having a disability, also play a role in making some people more vulnerable than others to the same climate impacts. This means we can't look at gender in isolation. A gender-responsive approach is intersectional, recognizing that people have multiple identities that shape their experiences. A gender-responsive approach focuses on three things: who matters, who decides, and who benefits. The answer to the question of who matters is, of course, everyone. Everyone matters when it comes to managing the impacts of climate change. This means that investments in adaptation must be designed to meet different needs, taking into account people's gender and their social status. When it comes to who decides, we must consider who is typically excluded from planning and decision-making. A gender-responsive approach brings diverse voices to the table, recognizing the value of their knowledge and their potential as agents of change. Without careful attention to gender and social dynamics, there is a risk that adaptation investments actually reinforce existing inequalities in wealth and power structures, rather than benefiting the most vulnerable people. Adaptation is effective when it is equitable, providing opportunities and benefits for all people. Governments, private sector actors, civil society organizations, and communities around the world are ramping up efforts to respond to the impacts of climate change. We have an opportunity to ensure that these efforts also generate progress towards gender equality. To make this happen, we need a gender-responsive approach to adaptation. This is the only way we can build families, communities, and societies that are resilient to the impacts of climate change.
So I'll end this section and transition to our next one about sustainability with another Ajman quote, where he states that racism and classism are bad for the environment and also bad for a broadly conceived notion of sustainability. So how should we be doing sustainability better?
So in this section, we're going to be bringing it a little bit closer to home with some things about Westchester and sustainability, as well as expanding further a little later about how to get people, especially in the global north, to care about climate change. So what you see on the screen here is Westchester University's greenhouse gas emissions in metric tons of carbon dioxide. You can see that there has been a steady decrease over the past couple of years, especially in 2021. But the one in yellow, which has been decreasing the most, are Scope 3 emissions of greenhouse gases, which are indirect emissions that mostly come from the transportation of students, such as commuters. So since 2021 was a full COVID year, you can obviously see that commuting definitely took a turn since everything was online. But all of the other scopes have been slowly going down over the years, which is still good. The average is about 31,027 metric tons, which is still something that we're going to have to work on, especially considering that according to the World Population Review Carbon Footprint Calculator for countries, Westchester emits the same amount of greenhouse gases as the Solomon Islands in 1 year. Now, the Solomon Islands is an island nation of around 6,500,000 people. So Westchester University and most US colleges produce the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions as a small island nation. I understand that is a very daunting statistic. Climate anxiety is very real, especially considering what you guys have said about how you feel about the climate crisis. But it is also important to focus on the good things that are happening and what you can control in order to inspire hope instead of fear. So some good things that Westchester University has been doing over the past couple of years is its geothermal heating system. Over 47% of building space is heated and cooled through geothermal processes as of 2021. Geothermal heating is a renewable resource that harnesses the consistent heat of the ground in order to generate electricity. Because of this shift, Westchester University's last coal-fired boiler plant was decommissioned in 2014 and also razed in 2018 in order to make room for a new LEED certified science and engineering center. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, which is a green building certification program that is recognized worldwide. A good number of buildings on campus are LEED certified, such as the Business and Public Management Building. There are also many student organizations that one can join online on RAM Connect, and the Sustainability Council meetings are open for all students, faculty, and staff members to discuss and influence Westchester University's own policies. So you can really get that sense of advocacy and really making a difference by letting your voice be heard. And perhaps one of the most exciting developments, Westchester University is currently planning zero waste initiatives, where ultimately the goal is to have more than 90% of waste diverted from landfills and incinerators. And there are so many other initiatives in place, like plans for carbon neutrality, organic gardens on North and South Campus, and so many other ways for people to get involved in making sure that Westchester does better in the future. So while these efforts are a small contribution in the grand scheme of things, they also set solid frameworks for sustainable living on an individual level while also examining global sustainability issues.
So Westchester is doing a lot, but as a predominantly white institution in the global north, especially one that produces as much greenhouse gas as a small island nation, Westchester still has pretty traditional ideas about sustainability and can always be doing better. So Ajuman introduces what he calls the just sustainability paradigm. And this brings together the two policy trajectories that I mentioned from the global north about traditional green sustainability and from the global south about anti-poverty reduction. So just sustainability changes the definition of sustainability a little bit. It implies a paradigm shift to give the power back to the people. It takes on a redistributive function in regards to social justice. So like the NAP video said, it's very important to bring every voice to the table and pay special attention to all the power relations and dynamics that exist within climate change. You can also change the definition of environment to as well to include a more encompassing definition of environment wherever humans live and work, and also includes social issues such as urban disinvestment and a lack of green spaces in cities, gentrification, racist housing policies, et cetera, et cetera. All of these should be considered part of the issues with the environment. So the just sustainability paradigm has 4 main areas that it is concerned with. One is quality of life. The second is present and future generations. Can we still live on this earth? Third is justice and equity. And fourth is living within ecosystem limits. So Westchester should keep these 4 areas in mind when it comes to their impact on students' lives and their impact on the community and the environment around them. So why aren't we at a reality of just sustainability yet? Why is it so hard to get people, especially people in the global north, to care about climate change and do the most basic things when it comes to climate activism? This is because research shows that when it comes to pro-environmental behaviors, people will only engage with them if they don't significantly change that person's life. So if they don't have substantial costs when it comes to time, discomfort, and money. And again, even though we talked a lot about how women generally care more about climate change than men, this is still true regardless of gender. So Dr. Wiggin, who I will talk about later in this presentation, says that climate inaction in the face of all the facts, even when you understand how bad it is and how worse it can get, climate inaction is still an advanced form of climate change denial. So obviously, this is a problem that we need to get over fast. Janet Swim, who is a climate activist and professor at Penn State University, who does a lot of the research around climate change and gender, also tracked 4 emotions impacts on how willing people generally are to engage with climate change activism. So these 4 emotions were hope, anxiety, helplessness, and boredom. Obviously, hope is the only positive indicator when it comes to how willing a person was to engage with climate change activism in the future. Anxiety and helplessness were slightly negative indicators, but the emotion that we're really interested in here is boredom, which was the most largest negative indicator by far. In Swim's definition of boredom, she says that it can arise when there is a cognitive mismatch between the demands of the task and one's mental resources to accomplish it. So either the task is perceived as too easy or too difficult. In this case, a lot of people perceive climate change as too difficult to solve, so they just disengage from the topic entirely. Boredom can also result from when individuals feel that a task lacks intrinsic meaning. So if people can't see how climate change affects them right now on a personal level, again, they're more willing to disengage with the topic and with climate change activism. So Swim writes that one strategy to overcome boredom in climate activists in the global north is by making meaning out of it, by building connections between climate change action and other sources of meaning in an individual's life, such as social relationships or valued social identities. So that is why we're getting into the last section of this presentation, which is about helping you tell your story about your personal relationship with climate change.
All right, so we drew inspiration from 2 projects to sort of guide this section. The first is the All We Can Save project, which is based on the book of the same name. The authors and the creators believe that the problem of the climate crisis is a leadership crisis, because society remains stuck in this sort of state of lukewarm concern and insufficient action as social, political, and economic systems continue to benefit those who already have wealth and social power. The project fosters public narrative shifts around climate truth, courage, and solutions through multivocal creative communication work. Dr. Catherine Wilkinson created the All We Can Save circles for open and honest climate communications. So we're going to be borrowing a couple of questions from session 4 for the theme of this conference.
The second project that we drew inspiration from is My Climate Story, and I'll play a short documentary about it and then summarize the information afterwards.
My climate story has been more about getting the students to see what's going on around them. The biggest impact I can have is dozens, low hundreds numbers of kids every year coming through the experiences that we're giving them.
Doing this climate story workshop with the students, vis-a-vis Penn, has been empowering for our students because it gave them permission to share what they thought was not even that significant. And it gave us as teachers a much more compassionate lens through which we can understand them.
The odds were kind of against something like this ever really working, that people would be able to show up to these workshops and be engaged and do emotional work, and yet it happened every week.
It's a kind of a cathartic experience for people to finally be able to talk with others about climate change and climate impacts, in some cases climate anxiety, that they've been sitting with all alone.
It's from these human stories that we're inspired to take action and inspired to really care about this issue.
One story might seem small at first, but if we have lots of stories together, you can see the trends across the stories. Stories are what make quantitative data meaningful.
In the last 100 to 200 years, the release of carbon emissions related to fossil fuels has completely changed that dynamic. It's really like increasingly wrapping a blanket around the planet that holds in the heat.
I mean, we had, for the first time, schools unable to be open, lack of air conditioning, and it's too hot for students to learn. It's not safe for them to be indoors. That's pretty incredible.
Climate change is hard to talk about. When or if we talk about it, we often use big numbers, like levels of atmospheric CO2 or rates of sea level rise.
How can the vastness of climate change be made meaningful on a human scale? Storytelling is the foundation of community and culture. Telling stories is a powerful form of climate action and can show how climate change links to other disasters, including the wildfire spread of COVID-19. Enter My Climate Story, a public engagement project seeking to help you document and share your climate story.
In workshops for climate storytellers, from the 6th grade on up, participants are sharing how we're making sense of global climate change.
Gathered together in a public story bank and shared across social media, these stories fuel the movement for meaningful action on climate.
They show how local climate impacts are shaping life stories and how they're making us feel.
For example, your city might have recently been experiencing hotter summers, making it unbearable to sleep at night. Or you're having heavier rains, making your basement wet and moldy. Or maybe your region has experienced increased hurricane intensity and frequency, putting your life and property at risk. No matter how small or large your story may be, we want to know, how are you sensing climate change? How does it make you feel?
So as the video stated, this is a project of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, directed by Dr. Bethany Wiggin from UPenn. So just in summary, a climate story, 1, shares an individual experience, 2, anchors itself to a specific location, and 3, invites the storyteller to include emotions, memories, personal reflections. You can see part of the workbook that they provide to people wanting to set up a My Climate Story workshop wherever they live or play. And you can also see some word association, just like we did at the beginning of this session, that exists on the My Climate Story Bank. So this is what we've gathered you all to here today to do. You can see Scizor, which is their climate storytelling tool. We're going to ask you questions along these same lines. Just 2 points of note. First, note that your climate story is exciting enough. Of course, people tend to think about climate change in the sense of huge natural disasters, but anything small enough, anything minuscule you can think that is affecting your climate is enough. For example, if you're a commuter to Westchester, and that commute is either getting longer or shorter. What does that mean for you? How does that impact your life? And the second point is that if environmental privilege, the fact that you don't have to think about climate change on a daily basis, is part of your story, that's okay. That's still a story. That's still part of your life. And that's something that you can focus on going forward. And finally, you can see an example of one story from the story bank. I just screenshotted one from nearby. This was someone talking about living in New Jersey and the weather getting more extreme. All right, so we want you to start thinking about your climate story. So Callie is going to drop the link for the Jamboard in the chat. If you've never used a Jamboard before, you just use the post-it note or sticky note function to post your answers. You can use the QR code if you have it on your phone, but if not, just use the link. And we're going to give everyone about 5 minutes to do that. So we'll see you around 1:44. All right, everyone. If you're not done with all of your answers yet, that is more than all right. Feel free to keep filling them out as we send you off into your breakout rooms. But we think the breakout rooms, even as uncomfortable as they are over Zoom, are very important because part of my climate story is what they call having climate conversations, honest and open communication about climate change and its effects on everyone. So Callie will send you off into breakout rooms, and it'll last around 5 minutes again. Reminiscent is such a cute one. Thank you, Owen. So as you can see, these are much more positive words. So thinking about tackling climate change in general, very overwhelming, but connecting with climate change and with other people that are affected by climate change shouldn't be so overwhelming. So that is the end of our session today. Once again, thank you everyone so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you to, once again, to our brilliant presenters for joining us today. And to our participants, thank you for your time, energy, and commitment to gender justice. Please consider filling out the evaluation, which will be sent to you by email. I believe there will also be a QR code that will be put in the chat if you need to record your attendance at the session today for any reason. We hope that you consider joining us at one of our next sessions, Imagining Life Beyond the Gender Binary, or a look into women and college debt, as well as our keynote this evening, Erica Hart, at 6 p.m. To learn more about these sessions, please visit our conference support hub. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to the presenters. Great job.